I would say for the size and the price, this camera probably packs the most punch out of what's available on the market at the moment. If you had told me 5 years ago or so that a camera this size that shoots 6K RED RAW that can cut in alongside footage from much more expensive REDs and you'd be struggling to tell the difference, I wouldn't have believed you. It turns on instantly, no boot up time, it's a really good price. The footage itself, I was really surprised how well it stood up against the Komodo. What a time that we're living in where you have a camera this size for such a good price that packs such a punch. So I have just left Nikon Australia where I have got my hands on a test unit for this camera here, the Nikon ZR. The first official collaboration between Nikon and RED. Longly anticipated, and yeah, a lot of people have been pretty excited for this release. If you watch my channel, you might have caught my review of the Z6 Mark III last year. My first time using or reviewing a Nikon camera, and I've got to say, I was pretty impressed. But this one, I think, is all of that tech coming together. RED RAW, ProRes RAW, Nikon RAW, all great codecs. Actually, I think my least favorite of those three would probably be ProRes RAW, because until recent times it wasn't even supported by DaVinci Resolve. At least now it is. However, personally, I probably think the other two codecs are better. When I tested the Z6 III last year, I had no gripes or issues with the Nikon RAW and RAW. It was a great file type. However, RED RAW, I will say, as a long-term RED user, that is my favorite RAW codec on the market by far. It's really good just in terms of file size versus quality, great to edit. I've never had a problem with it being sluggish or anything like that. And yeah, just all the controls it gives you in post, the color science, the log curve. It's a really good codec. So that would probably be my codec of choice when using this camera. But I will say, it's cool that you've got the other options as well. Because one issue, and not my only issue with REDs over the years, is, for example, right now, my Komodo, it will record in ProRes 422, which is a handy option to have, using your full sensor and recording in 4K ProRes. That's really handy for a lot of jobs and very edit friendly and things like that. Sure. However, there's a lot of other jobs where even that is still a bit too big for a lot of clients if you're doing a lot of long takes and things like that. So actually having some more compressed codec options is really handy. I know on my C80, me and a few people I work with have actually been using codecs like the H.265 and the long GOP quite a bit because they're still 10-bit 422 and the compression has gotten so good. Those are really useful codecs, and I know, for example, the H.265 out of the Canons is a great codec just to give to people directly when they're going to be doing the post internally or something like that. It just shows up as an easy to open file that isn't in the MXF wrapper, and yeah, will play in your run-of-the-mill software on your computer, but also very easy to edit. So I actually think it's cool that this camera has such a variety of codec options, because depending what you're doing, sometimes you might want RED RAW, shooting your own stuff, shooting something that you want to be a bit more stylized and you want the end result to look really nice. Or you might be shooting corporate videos for a client where they're going to do the post internally, or you're going to Dropbox them the files at the end of the shoot or something like that. Small files that are still good quality will be a win in that situation. And I think computers have gotten better at handling H.265 and long GOP codecs in recent times. I know in the past when I had an FS7, the long GOP codec was the devil. Like, you'd shoot in that if you wanted to stitch someone up, really. Anytime I tried to edit that, it sucked. So I never used to use that. I was pleasantly surprised when I got the C80 that now things have turned a corner and that stuff is much better to edit. Whether that be the better processors these days or the software and hardware talking to each other in a better way, whatever it is, but things have progressed and those codecs are much more useful now. So on a similar note, as a long-term RED user, I'm going to tell you some of the main things I have both liked and disliked about those cameras over the years, which I think is relevant to this release. So what I've liked: RED RAW. Like I said, in my opinion, best RAW codec on the market. You got different compression options, well, maybe less so on this ZR, but even so, I just think it's a really good codec. Yeah, like I said, in terms of file size versus quality and end results, really good. RED color science. I've always been pretty happy with RED color science. It's nice and neutral, good to grade. If you've never graded RED footage before, I'd say it's a dream compared to most other manufacturers in the affordable space. Sure, ARRI is probably still known for maybe having the best color science, but who can afford that for most things, for most people? Doing regular jobs, even up to a high level, I wouldn't recommend you buying one of their cameras. I'd rent it when you need it, because for most people, they're not a good investment. So I don't even think they're really in the conversation in this case. So yeah, RED, I think it's a really good color science and good files to grade. And let me just chuck in a bit of extra perspective there, as someone who's across all the brands. Sony have gotten better. I would call Sony very contemporary color science, which I think a lot of people have gotten used to color grading. And there's certain LUTs that do seem to work really well with their S-Log3 footage. I would say, like, almost say the younger generation would kind of prefer the Sony look these days. And maybe it's closer to how ARRI stuff looks, to be honest. I'd say Sony veers a bit more towards blues and greens, which a lot of people like. Canon, RED, and Blackmagic all have a bit of a warmer look, I would say, and a bit more, maybe you'd call it natural. However, I've noted everything has its pros and cons, because I've noticed Canon definitely has a bit of a magenta shift, which isn't always flattering. Sometimes I'm actually removing that a little bit when I grade. So it's a pretty faithful color science, but yeah, a bit of a magenta push. Blackmagic, similar to Canon and RED in a lot of ways, but sometimes it handles certain colors weird. I would say out of those three, which I think are fair to compare, the RED is the most neutral, the most accurate, and the most filmy, all things being equal. So yeah, if it's your first time using RED RAW, I think you're going to be pretty impressed and happy with it. So yeah, that's been one thing I've loved with RED over the years. Now, I just want to talk about some cons quickly with REDs over the years. Always been really bad for audio. This looks like it's fixed that. Better preamps and 32-bit float internal, which is very handy. Knowing that you can have a mic on that will never clip, great, super handy, really good feature. Why the fuck could RED not put these preamps into their much more expensive cameras over the years and save everyone a nightmare with all these workarounds and whatnot you've got to do? Yeah, that's a whole other rant. But yeah, let's just say REDs have always sucked for audio. Simple as that. This looks like it's better. So RED and Nikon coming together with some common sense engineering. That's great. And fixing a RED gripe I've had. Look, RED images are really good and their older cameras are great value, but you know, something like the Dragon, which I own, it's big, it's power hungry, and even though I think the images pack a lot of punch for how much the camera costs, yeah, it's really not as convenient as something like this that turns on instantly, no boot up time, it's a really good price. Yeah, I think for most people this is going to be a better option than those older REDs, even though personally I think cameras like the Dragon and, well, all of them really, everything in the DSMC 1 and 2 lineup, to be honest, do have a little bit of secret sauce that some of the newer cameras don't. I do think you can get a more filmy, I don't know, it's hard to put in words, but there is something more to the image out of those cameras, which I do think looks better. But pros and cons, usability, for most people, you're probably going to be better off getting one of these ZRs. That's all of my initial thoughts, and I'll go into the testing of this with all that stuff in mind. I know this is going to produce some nice images, but yeah, I just want to see how it goes as an all-round camera, keeping in mind that it is targeting professionals, not just people doing like aesthetic content for YouTube and social media. So it does need to fit into a production space. And so I'm going to definitely look at the practical side of things and see how it goes, thinking of it in the context of a working professional filmmaker. So yeah, excited to test this out and look forward to sharing some results. So I've had the Nikon ZR for almost a week now, and I've tried to test it out as much as I can around other bill paying shoots. It's been a really interesting camera to use. I think if you had have told me 5 years ago or so that a camera this size that shoots 6K RED RAW that can cut in alongside footage from much more expensive REDs and you'd be struggling to tell the difference, I wouldn't have believed you. And the fact that it's put out by Nikon. There's a bunch of videos out there on this camera, so I just want to keep this just to my unique kind of niche takes. So after using this a bit, I'll just go through some of the things that I liked and I didn't like. So pros: good battery life, great size, great screen, good autofocus, definitely up there with Canon and Sony in that department, which is good. And I think will become a benchmark as time goes on. You know, if you want to put out a competitive camera, it needs to be as good as those in the autofocus department, which this definitely is. This is using autofocus right now, and I haven't seen any issues with the autofocus performance of this camera. The footage itself, I was really surprised how well it stood up against the Komodo when I did the testing. And look, of course, my testing's not that scientific necessarily, but I tried my best to match the shots and I think they looked pretty similar. If you went back and forth, and I think even I would have trouble picking what was shot on which camera if you were to not show me the file names and I just had to look purely off images. The Nikon stood up really well. I was honestly thinking that I was going to see the sky blow out and the highlight roll off not be as good on the ZR compared to the Komodo, but it wasn't really the case. They were very similar in the highlight performance, which to me is a pretty important thing I look for in cameras. But I would say the ZR seemed to have nicer shadows and more vibrant colors. And I guess it is much newer than the Komodo, so it's kind of to be expected in a way, but also pretty wild when you consider the price point of this camera. Looking through the footage in Resolve, the RED RAW stuff is a pleasure to grade, and have no doubts that you'd be able to get really amazing footage with this camera. And yeah, I was pretty impressed with the shots I've got and found it easy to grade. Now I'm going to go into a few things that I thought were cons of the camera. And the first thing I'm going to talk about is just lack of different varieties of the R3D codec. So I didn't really know this heading in, but it only has one. And I would have assumed that that is similar to ELQ on RED's Komodo, Raptor, etc. lines, which personally I think is a really good codec, and most people I know who own those cameras use that codec quite a bit because it's small file sizes but still really good quality. So it's the go-to for me. The RED RAW variant that this records in is actually pretty big files. It seemed to be around 3 to 4 times bigger than the equivalent resolution files on ELQ shot with my Komodo. So to me, that's a bit of a con, because I feel like the people that would be using this camera and that this camera would be marketed towards wants to get a bit more storage on their cards and doesn't want to be burning through that much data. And, you know, R3D being one of the main draw cards of this camera, realistically, if you want the best results, that's the codec you want to be shooting in. But if those files are so massive, it suddenly makes R3D less appealing, which I think is unfortunate. I did some testing, and I know if you were recording in Nikon RAW, all the same frame rates and everything like that, in the normal mode, it's about half the size. So you'll get double the amount of footage on your cards if you're using NRAW. And I did some very non-technical testing, and it kind of seems like if you match up the color spaces in the proper way using Resolve, take it from a Nikon RAW log and color space into a RED log color space and then convert it to 709. It looks a lot nicer than the standard Nikon to 709 conversion, and I would imagine looks very similar to RED RAW. So you do have that option. And on the note of codecs, I know ProRes LT is going to be coming to this camera as well, which will also be a very good feature to have, because only having ProRes HQ, same thing. Those files are too big for most things. It's not really a codec you'd want to be shooting in too much. So there's certain people using this camera as like an insert cam on high-end productions, crash cam, extra angle camera, or a whole bunch of stuff like that, that will love those full strength codecs. But I think your average punter would want more compressed variants of R3D, because I've talked about this before. Always one of the best things about RED RAW was that you could dial in your desired amount of compression. Back on, you know, DSMC1, DSMC2, it was worked a different way. It'd be 6:1, 8:1, 10:1, 12:1, etc. So you could make things more compressed to save file space and to make it more suitable file sizes for what you're shooting. So only having one variant of RED RAW, to me, is a big disadvantage. And yeah, hopefully in the future, with those additional codec options like the ProRes LT, and hopefully they start to offer some more RED variants as well. That's something that could be solved with firmware updates on this camera. Other than that, it's hard to have too many gripes about this camera, given how much it costs and how good the images look out of it. It packs a lot of punch, and I would say for the size and the price, it may just be the camera that can get you the best images on the market. Use cases for this, you know, travel, find a nice lens, it's not too big. This would be so good for traveling. You could make really good travel films with this camera, get really nice images, and if you know how to grade, you could get super high-end results with this camera. So that's one definite kind of use case for it. Another thing I forgot to mention that I really liked about this camera is the IBIS is really good. You can walk the streets, shoot in handheld with this camera and get really stable footage. So another thing that goes in its favor if you were wanting to use this as a travel kind of camera. The 32-bit float internal audio, although I didn't get the chance to test that out too much. If you were to get a compact video mic for this, like the little Sennheiser ones, or the Rode Video NTG, or something smaller, whatever is a suitable size, this would be so good for run and gun documentary in scenarios where having a bigger camera wouldn't be suitable. Because, I have mentioned this before, bigger cameras do make people more intimidated and do make them act differently. So there is a strong use case for smaller cameras. And yeah, in certain environments, this would be epic. And having the option of knowing you might get pretty good audio because of the 32-bit float, that's pretty cool. And nice to see a camera brand drop that feature. Anyway, that's about the only thoughts I had on this for now. I didn't have it for enough time to go too much deeper than that, but hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts, and let me know if you're thinking about buying this and why you are or aren't adding this to your kit. Cheers for watching, guys.